Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Brand Called You. This is a global podcast where we talk to some of the world's most interesting thought leaders. And I'm happy to say we have one here today. Dr. Daniel Schacter has been a professor of psychology at Harvard University since 1991. And his specialty is memory in all its facets: elusive, wily, unpredictable, unreliable, and ultimately life-saving. He first wrote about it in his book, Searching for Memory, in 1996, and then later a seminal book called The 7 Sins of Memory, How the Mind Forgets and Remembers, which is where I first discovered him. But he's also published many, many articles, and apparently, according to Google Scholar, they've been cited over 125,000 times, although I bet he wouldn't quite remember each one. He's received many, many awards, including most recently the award for Distinguished Scientific Contributions from the American Psychological Association. And perhaps most excitedly, his book, The 7 Sins of Memories, How the Mind Forgets and Remembers, is actually having its 20th anniversary edition, or it had its 25th anniversary edition. Excuse me, let me start again. The 20th anniversary edition has come out, and with some revisions. I'm very excited to talk to you. So welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So I hope you don't mind, but I might start with something a bit topical, and then we'll go to the more abstract. Again, I'm the daughter of scientists. I even have an uncle whose license plate says E does not equal MC squared. So these are like serious geeks and nerds in my family. So I tend to see everything through the lens of science, even though I'm a storyteller. We hear so much today about the big lie. And our former president is convinced that he won the election, supposedly, and so are many of his followers. And, I tend to watch more of the liberal news, in which they always seem to attribute his believing that to a lie. And I tend to intuitively wonder if that's not true. I wonder if it's possible for one to gaslight themselves. So in other words, if you say something enough, is it possible that you could begin to remember it as such? And in turn, could it be possible that his followers are remembering it as absolute truth?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's hard to say definitively in any one case. What we know, more broadly, is that certainly repetition will make just about any statement seem more believable or enhance the experience of perceived truth. That's something we all kind of, I think, intuitively know. In the laboratory, it's been studied under the rubric of something called the illusory truth effect. So just repeating a statement, unless it's totally outlandish and impossible, will increase perceived truth in most people. And we also know that repeated retrieval of information from memory strengthens that memory. And so you put those two things together, and I think it certainly is possible for someone with enough repetition to convince themselves of something that maybe at one time they believed not to be true, or despite outside evidence. Again, in the case of Trump, it's hard to get inside one person's head and to say what the state of affairs is. But more generally, yeah, I think it's possible.
Well, let me ask, because I think we're talking about first the illusory truth within yourself, and then the way it's perceived by others. And this leads me to another question, which is whether or not he believes it, he speaks with great passion and emotion when he says it. And does the fact that he's connecting what he's saying, whether it's a lie or whether he believes it, to emotion, does that make it more believable to the listener?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that we have good evidence on that specific point from the psychological literature. That would be, that would come down to the question of, for highly emotional events, is there a greater illusory truth effect? That's a really interesting question. There could be something out there in the scientific literature that speaks to it, but I'm not aware that it is. I think again, a lot would depend on the particulars of the person, of the the issue under discussion. But certainly, yeah, that's at least plausible. I don't know that we have any evidence for it.
So, I'm a professional storyteller, and what I call myself now is a story strategist. So I go into companies and help them use storytelling. And my specialty is scientists, right? So I work with a lot of data-driven people. And if you're a PhD researching, the sweat under your arms for Colgate, how do you make that interesting? And so I always try to have them attached to an emotion and then hang the facts on that. And one of the reasons I do that is there was some research out of Princeton. I think it was identified as neural coupling. Does that ring a bell, that phenomenon? Where what they found is if you deliver something and are emotionally connected to it, so the emotional regions of your brain are lighting up at exactly the same moment, the same regions in the brain are lighting up for the listener. And I guess, yeah.
Yeah, there has been work with functional neuroimaging showing that and related phenomena. And we also know from the memory literature that certainly emotional arousal is one of the most potent ways of enhancing the vividness and long-lastingness of a memory. So from that perspective, from the perspective of the memory literature, certainly that's a potent way of increasing the impact of advertising or just about anything else on memory.
I hope you don't mind if I pick your brain a little, but I always, whenever I'm trying to get a scientist who's so in his head, cognitive thinking, to be emotional, the first thing I do is I ask for a personal memory. But what I've discovered, and I'm no scientist, this is purely by practice, and I would love to get your take on this. If I ask them to, for example, reach in an imaginary box and pick out an object that was precious to one of their grandparents, not even their parents, distant, an object, they're more likely to conjure up a more accurate and distinct and passionate memory than if I say to them, what moves you about what moves you about your grandmother? So in other words, if I ask a direct question, they'll give me what they think is the right answer. If I distract them with an inanimate object memory, it seems always to elicit a much more accurate response. And I haven't been able to identify what could be happening, but I've had such success grabbing for a random object out of the air or making it their great grandparents versus their own memories. Do you have any idea what might be happening?
Well, it sounds to me like you might be in the former case where you're getting the more emotional response, targeting something much more specific and maybe a specific memory that they have related to, for example, their grandparents. And it's those specific autobiographical, what we psychologists call autobiographical memories, episodic memories. Those tend to be, very tightly tied to emotion, whereas asking for, a more general appraisal might lead you away from autobiographical and specific memories that tend to be a bit more emotionally charged and thinking in more abstract terms. So I think that your former question likely brings into play memories that are, have a better chance of being emotional, whereas your latter one is more targeted at kind of abstract conceptual thinking.
But I was also wondering, if you ask somebody at a job interview, how do you handle conflict? Give me some examples of the way you've handled conflict in the past. I have this feeling that there's a part of the brain that is also very sensitive to what they should say, to expectation.
Sure.
And somehow if you relieve them of that responsibility by just saying, oh, tell me about that watch you're wearing. And I guess I wanted to ask you, how much of our memory is imprisoned by group expectation?
Well, I think we are sensitive to social context. And so to me, it would just be less a question of memory per se and more a question of, how we want to use memory in a social context, what we're comfortable revealing. So yeah, for sure, memories are one among many things that we're going to bring to bear in a social interaction. And like anything else, we're going to try to make them appropriate to a social context and a social interaction.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I found so fascinating also in your book was how deceptive memory is. So for example, my mother is a Holocaust survivor, and I also work a lot with them with storytelling. And when many of them were alive and I would do workshops, I noticed that they had begun to make themselves heroes in their own story. How does that work? Because I know they believed it. I know it was definitely believed, and it was a shift. And I wondered, is that some sort of a survival mechanism?
Well, I think it's a pretty normal feature of memory. So when I talk about the 7 sins of memory, I have 3 that are different kinds of forgetting, and maybe we'll talk about those later. I call them sins of omission. And then I have 4 that relate to distorted and unwanted memories that I call sins of commission. That is, when a memory is present, but it's either wrong or unwanted. And there's one of them that applies to the situation you just described, which I call bias or retrospective bias, which is very normal, common part of memory, where what we remember about the past is very much influenced by our current psychological state, our current needs, desires, knowledge, beliefs. Those all skew how we remember the past. And one of several kinds of retrospective biases I talk about in the book on the 7 sins of memory is kind of a self-enhancing memory bias. So there's a lot of really interesting research that's been produced by psychologists that shows that we tend to sort of massage the past in ways that make us look good, that kind of elevate the self. Very, very common, very pervasive, and that may be exactly what's going on in the stories that you're referring to, where people, as they remember these things over and over again, tend to make themselves more increasingly heroic, perhaps.
Like they talk about grandiose thinking in psychological terms. Is that taken to the extreme?
That might be a more extreme version of the kind of the normal self-enhancing bias that social psychologists, cognitive psychologists have documented in many different ways. And these can lead to something that the social psychologist Shelley Taylor a couple of decades ago called positive illusions, where we have positive illusions about ourselves that can be somewhat adaptive in the sense that maybe having a higher opinion of ourselves to some degree can encourage us to take chances or risks that we might otherwise not. They can be adaptive, these positive illusions, but if we get too untethered from reality, they can also get us into trouble.
Are they culturally specific? Like, for example, it might be more advantageous to be a hero or to be a winner in American culture, for example, as opposed to, I lived in the Netherlands for years where you're not supposed to stick your head higher up than anyone else. I wonder if you found that it's culturally specific.
Yeah, there is research on that, and I talk about a little bit about that in the book. And it's generally along the lines you suggest that, for example, it's typically in the literature phrased as a contrast between Western and Eastern cultures. Western cultures, maybe American to the extreme, would tend to show this to a greater degree than Asian, Eastern cultures, where the role of the self is more downplayed, and you see that in a more modified memory bias.
So you talked about the sins of omission, and I want to ask you something else. And I think this is related to trauma, but so my mother her name is Sharika, and she had 2 sisters, Rozhika and Borishka. We used to call them the Gabor sisters of New Jersey. They all handled their memories of the Holocaust differently, but the result was always the same, which was silence. So the 2 older sisters would always say to me, ask me anything you want. And whenever I would, they'd say, I just don't remember. My mother, on the other hand, would walk out of the room. Her face would turn, hollow. So I knew she remembered, but refused to talk about it. And when people would push her, I would say no. I intuitively feel that actually what's keeping her alive, and she's alive at 95, is her refusal to conjure memories. So I guess I wanted to ask you, is there something that's very, in a way, healthy about keeping tight secrets? Is there a danger in her revealing those memories?
Potentially. I mean, we have a tension here between a couple different dynamic processes in memory. On the one hand, one of the most potent ways of keeping a memory alive over time is to retrieve it, and retrieve it either internally, mentally, or talk about it out loud to other people. So the first of the three sins of commission that I talk about is transience. That is the notion, that observation that all other things being equal, memories from a long time ago are harder to retrieve than more recent memories. So we know that there's a forgetting curve where we have very good memory for an experience at short delays, and there's usually a quick drop off and then a slower drop off over time. That's the curve of forgetting, or in my terms, kind of the curve of transience. And one of the things we know is that if you treat, one of the ways you can slow down that forgetting is to retrieve information, to kind of test yourself for memory. That can selectively slow down the loss of memory over time. So on the one hand, if you're not retrieving a memory, then you're more likely to lose access to it. But again, in the case you're referring to, not talking about a memory is not necessarily not retrieving a memory. So you may mentally relive it and keep it alive and just not disclose it to other people. But on the other hand, one of the seventh sins of memory, the seventh sin of memory that I talk about, I refer to as persistence. So these are highly emotional, traumatic memories that can intrude on our minds, can keep us awake at night. They result from disturbing or even traumatic experiences, and they can be, for some people, psychologically disabling. So not talking about or not retrieving a traumatic experience can buffer the negative psychological effects of those disturbing memories. They don't necessarily wipe them out of your mind, but it can take, not thinking about them too much can take some of the sting out of those persisting intrusive memories. So you have the tension between these two things. Not thinking about and talking about a memory may make you more apt to lose access to that memory because the processes that result in transience, forgetting over time, kind of take over, but may have some benefit in protecting you from the negative effects of remembering. Now, a really interesting phenomenon that's I talk about in this updated version of the Seven Sins of Memory, that's really been documented most extensively over the last 2 decades since I wrote the original book way back in 2001, is something called fading affect bias. And what fading affect bias refers to is the fact that over time, we tend to, in most situations, lose the negative affect from a disturbing experience faster than we lose the positive affect.
Interesting.
It's not necessarily the case that we forget the negative experience, but the negative affect associated with it tends to fade over time, and that is something that can contribute to psychological well-being. So one of the other more general points I made in the original Seven Sins of Memory book, and I updated in the revised version, is that I call these things the sins of memory, the seven by analogy with these seven ancient deadly sins, and they can cause a lot of problems and even wreak havoc in everyday life, forgetting, distortion, and so forth, persisting memories that keep us up at night. But I try to make the point that these seven sins aren't really flaws or defects in memory, but they're kind of prices we pay for adaptive features of memory that make the system generally work well over time. And this fading affect bias, I think, fits in that category of kind of an adaptive form of forgetting that just kind of happens naturally. Again, it's not that we totally forget the negative experience. That may persists, but that negative affect associated with it tends to fade over time, and maybe not talking about and retrieving a memory can contribute to that. And going back to the example of your mother, that might be an adaptive thing.
In my own case, I was attacked in a stairwell when New York was at its worst, when I was 21, and for many years I couldn't be in an enclosed space. And I was thinking about it the other day. I have none of that now. None of that now. It's interesting.
That might be over a long period of time, the operation of this fading affect bias that we just discussed.
But, I read a fascinating study. I think it was out of Milwaukee. The general understanding with civil servants was that if they went through a traumatic experience, you would have them debrief, talk about it. And there was some scientists that did a study with a fireman who had found a dead body, charred, and he realized it was a friend of his when he brought it to the morgue, and he was very traumatized. And rather than debrief him immediately, they had him wait 6 months and write about the experience retroactively. Mm-hmm. And they found physiologically he fared better in every level. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Well, that's related. There is a specific line of research that's been associated with the psychologist Jamie Pennebaker. This may have been his work or something that spun off of that, who has shown that specifically writing about traumatic experiences, can help you work through them and help produce a better outcome in terms of relieving some of the distressing symptoms that accompany trauma. So yeah, that is
there's a time continuum, right? Because I guess what I'm asking is how is it healthier? How does your memory change over time? So when you imagine a trauma 6 months later, are you kind of repairing yourself by remembering it 6 months after the event versus immediately?
I don't think you could say categorically that that at one time you're repairing yourself more so than another. I think it depends on how you work through it. So one of the distinctions that people make in this field, and I discuss in my chapter on persistence, is the distinction between sort of endlessly ruminating over time on a traumatic experience, being sort of overwhelmed by negative affect, and then contrasting that with kind of constructively working through, possibly in therapy or by writing about that experience. And so what one wants to do is to find a way to constructively work through that experience. And Pennebaker's work suggests that writing about it is a good way to organize it in your mind and possibly help take some of the sting out of those persisting negative impacts, as opposed to just ruminating in an unproductive way and kind of being captured by the experience.
But when you write about it, you talk about truth a lot. Is it possible that, is there any such thing as truth in memory? I know that's a very broad question, but maybe part of that healing process is reconstructing truth to accommodate what you can handle emotionally.
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. But more generally, if we talk about truth in memory, we can say that there's an objective standard against which memory can be compared. And in fact, that's one of the basic tenets methodologically of laboratory experiments on memory. One of the reasons why we do experiments in the lab is that we can control the input to memory. We know what at a perceptual level you experienced, then we can see later on what you remember, and we can see to what extent does your memory match features of the original experience, or to what extent do you distort it. So ultimately for memory, truth is subjective, and what you're remembering is very much influenced again by your current knowledge, your beliefs, your needs, your motivations. All those things impact the way in which you remember a past experience. But there are elements of objective reality against which we can measure that experience. Now, one of the places where you see this dynamic having major consequences is in eyewitness identification.
Yeah.
where one of the things we've learned over the years now is that the most prominent feature of wrongful convictions of individuals who are exonerated of crimes based on DNA, the most common thing that put them there in the first place is some form of eyewitness identification. Roughly 70% of these cases, if you go to the website of the Innocence Project, who tracks these things. So there's a case where, again, you have a question of, did that person accurately identify an individual who committed a crime? And we know that sometimes they don't. So there is an objective standard against which we can test memory. And when you deviate from that standard, and there are good reasons, and we understand as memory researchers why, to some extent, why that happens, it can have major consequences in everyday life.
Is that the same reason they don't accept lie detector tests now? As in court anymore?
No, I wouldn't say it's the same reason or the same thing there. I think there are, somewhat two separate issues there about, the question of the reliability of lie detection. But we do know that memories can be inaccurate, and those and that there's no infallible way of telling the difference between a true and a false memory. We've done a lot of work in my lab, really starting in the mid-1990s, using neuroimaging techniques such as PET scanning, positron emission tomography, and then after that, functional MRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging scanning, where we and others have done this work as well. We put people in the scanner. We may input them a list of words or maybe pictures, and then later on we test them. We test their memories under conditions where we know it's likely that they're going to misremember, falsely remember some of the items that we showed them previously. So, one very well-known paradigm in memory research for inducing a certain kind of a false memory, false recognition, is a paradigm is originally discovered by the psychologist James Deese back in the 1950s, and then it was revived in the 1990s by the cognitive psychologists Henry Roediger and Kathleen McDermott. And in this paradigm, you hear a list of words that are all related to one another: candy, sour, sugar, bitter, good, taste, tooth, nice, honey, soda, chocolate, heart, cake, eat, pie. You hear a list of words like that, and then later on, I'm going to give you a recognition test, and now I'm going to scan your brain while this is happening, and I'm going to put up, for example, the word taste and ask you, was that one of the words on the list that that you heard earlier in the experiment? And that was one of the words that I just said, taste. So if you said, yeah, that was on the list, you would be right. And then I might put in show you a word like point, and you would say, no, that wasn't on the list because that has nothing to do with any of the words that I mentioned. And then I would throw in the critical word sweet. Was that one of the words on the list? And most people, and probably some people watching or listening to this podcast, will claim with high confidence that sweet was on the list, but it wasn't. But it's the word that is related to all those words that I said: candy, sour, sugar, bitter, etc. So now the question is, if we have you in the fMRI scanner and you've heard a list of words like the one I read out, and we show you taste, that word was really on the list, and you say, yeah, I remember that, versus we show you sweet, and you say, yeah, I remember that one, but it wasn't really on the list. Can we tell the difference in the brain between the true memory and the false memory? And the answer is yeah, to a limited degree, we can. There are some differences between the true and the false memory. We showed that initially, and others have shown similar phenomena over the years. And then you ask the question, okay, if you can do that, can you now use this in the courtroom?
Yeah.
And we're not really at the point where you can use it in the courtroom yet. We see some of these differences in studies where we're looking at, a group of individuals. We're using many lists. I just gave you one example. We average across to get a strong signal. We average across the participants, we average across lists. But of course, in the courtroom, we want to know about one event, whether this is a true memory or a false memory. And there's been some progress recently in showing that we can get some distinction in the brain, even for one event, but it's really not to the point where we can use it yet confidently in the courtroom.
However, I could see down the road this having profound implications for justice in the courtroom, right? I mean, because so many people are put away for that reason, as you point out.
Yeah, and we need better methods to make this very important distinction. We're just not at the point in our neuroimaging research yet where we can confidently apply it to one person for one event, in a high stakes situation like the courtroom, but we are making progress.
I'm just one or two more questions and then we'll wrap up. As a storyteller, I'm in the business of words. And one of the things that fascinated me was a chapter you wrote on how if you end a sentence with a particular word, it really might affect somebody's memory of a particular event just based on where you put a word in a sentence, for example. Maybe you could just comment on that for a second.
I think what the study you're referring to there was one in which the preceding context of the sentence biases your interpretation one way or another. So I think the more general point would be that your memory for any word in a sentence is going to be influenced by the preceding context. You may interpret the word differently depending on what the preceding context of the sentence is, and that will have downstream consequences for your memory. So
in other words, just by the way you frame a sentence, you can manipulate memory.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Which is very helpful to me, by the way, as a practitioner. And also as somebody who collects stories, it's very, very interesting to me. In concluding, I know you're celebrating this 20th anniversary edition. You mentioned one of the changes, but what are some of the other ways that you added? For example, did you look at the latest studies in neuroscience? I'm curious how you updated your book.
That's a good question. The way I did it was for each of the 7 sins, and then for this concluding chapter, making the point that these sins have adaptive aspects, I looked at 2 developments over the past 2 decades that I thought were particularly interesting from the perspective of memory research and everyday implications. And in some cases, I talked about purely psychological aspects. In other cases, for example, one of the updates for the chapter on misattribution, misattribution is where we misattribute the source of our memory. So in the experimental example we just went over for sweet, you say, oh, I remember that I heard that word earlier. No, that's a misattributed memory. You didn't actually hear it earlier. So in the update for the chapter on the sin of misattribution, I have a section called "Have We Found the Truth Machine Yet?" And I go over some of the issues that we discussed about using neuroimaging to distinguish between true and false memories. For others, for example, for the chapter on transience, one of the things I talk about is the impact of technology on memory. There's a lot of concern out there that because we're relying on Google and our smartphones that we may actually, and GPS, that we may actually be unknowingly creating impairments on our own memory. So I discuss some of the work there. I'm not quite as alarmist as some other people are, that we're all going to become a bunch of amnesic patients because we rely on GPS. But there are some interesting findings that I discussed that do suggest that there can be some negative as well as positive impacts of technology on memory. And so I discussed a host of issues. I get into fake news and the illusion of truth that we talked about earlier when I talk about some of the updates on the sin of suggestibility. And then in the concluding chapter, where I talk about adaptive aspects of memory, to my mind, one of the important developments over the past 2 decades, and I have a personal stake in this because we've worked on this a lot in my lab, is the idea that some of the inaccuracies and distortions in memory arise because our memories, while they help us to remember the past, are at least as important for imagining and planning for the future. So we've done a lot of work in my lab showing that there are very striking similarities, both neural and cognitive, between remembering the past and imagining the future. And at a theoretical level, what I have tried to argue is that our memories, specifically our episodic memories, are really very flexible and allow us to take bits and pieces of past experience, recombine them, and run simulations of upcoming future events based on our past experience. And that's a very good thing, an adaptive aspect of memory, that we can use it flexibly to plan for the future, but that very flexibility may contribute to some of these memory distortions that we talked about. So I have a section in the concluding adaptive aspects chapter talking about some of that work.
My very first job, and I shouldn't have had it, was working with sexually abused kids with no training. And I intuitively got them to share stories of play, for example, because I knew play was joyous and it wouldn't. But one of the things I saw in their faces was, there was a happiness and a joy in the memory. And I later on, many years later, read that in just imagining something happy, for example, having gang members reimagine a more joyous life for themselves, you actually physiologically change the brain chemistry. Your cortisol levels go down, your stress hormone reduces, you have a heightened sense of pleasure. And I wonder if that's part of the reason we're able to imagine a future, is that we're literally changing all sorts of hormones by imagining. All sorts of chemicals are actually changing as if we're recreating that experience.
Yeah, that aspect of it we haven't really looked at. So I don't have a lot to say about that. But more generally, the critical point that we and others have documented is that when you imagine a future or other hypothetical experiences, you are engaging many of the same brain regions as when you remember a past experiences, that they all seem to rely on a common underlying network of brain regions. Now, there are some differences, and of course, we can tell the difference between memory and imagination. Otherwise, if we couldn't, we would be in a lot of trouble. But the similarities are very, very striking and may contribute to the kind of phenomena you just described.
And is this where your latest research is going, towards future thinking? Is this?
Yeah, we've been doing that now for really a little over a decade, and we're continuing to work on that, trying to understand how we use memory to think about the future, both at psychological and neural levels. And we've been doing some work lately, kind of an offshoot of that work on imagination, specifically on memory and creativity, a very related topic, where we've been looking at some of the neural underpinnings of creative thought and how that relates to memory and ways in which memory can enhance creativity.
I could go on, but I won't take any more of your time, but I just really want to thank you so much. And I really will look forward to reading all about your newest research.
Well, great. Enjoy talking, and thanks for having me.
No, I hope I wasn't too unscientific with you.
No, not at all.
Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.